Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know, when you think about geology, specifically tectonic plates, there's this, there's a distinct inevitability to the whole process. Two massive continental plates grind against each other, and literally anything caught along that fault line is just subjected to this immense continuous pressure. In most cases, the rock in the middle gets entirely pulverized, it just turns to dust.
Yeah, it basically follows the path of least resistance. The rock shatters because it simply cannot withstand the sheer mechanical force of two larger bodies colliding over centuries. It's just too much pressure.
Right. But every so often, under very specific chemical and physical conditions, the material caught between those plates doesn't shatter. It absorbs the heat, it absorbs the pressure, and it actually crystallizes, becomes something entirely distinct and highly resilient, sort of like a diamond. And looking at the historical sources covering the ancient Kingdom of Iberia, that geological fault line is really the most accurate way to understand their existence.
It really is a perfect parallel.
So today, we are doing a deep dive into this ancient state situated in the South Caucasus. This roughly corresponds to modern-day eastern Georgia. And this kingdom existed from roughly the 4th century BCE to the late 6th century. Just as a note, this discussion is part of our Caucasian history series.
And, the primary objective today is to dissect exactly how this kingdom survived and adapted.
Yeah.
Because for centuries, Iberia acted as a critical buffer state. They were stuck right on that geopolitical fault line between the Roman Empire to the west and the Parthian and later Sasanian empires to the east.
Two absolute heavyweights.
Exactly. We're looking at the specific mechanisms they used to forge a really distinct cultural, linguistic, and religious identity while constantly navigating the ambitions of the ancient world's absolute superpowers.
So to understand how they achieved that survival, we need to look at the foundation first. The origins of Iberia emerged from ancient tribal confederations located in the Kura River Valley. Now, the sources trace these tribes back to the ancient Kura-Araxes culture. And for context, if you are not super familiar with Bronze Age archaeology, the Kura-Araxes culture was this widespread society known for distinct black burnished pottery and wattle and daub architecture. But, a collection of tribes living in mud brick houses doesn't equal a unified kingdom.
No, it definitely doesn't.
The actual catalyst for the formation of a unified state actually comes from far outside the Caucasus.
Yeah, the real catalyst is the collapse of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Achaemenid Empire was, the preeminent superpower of its day. It stretched from the Balkans all the way to the Indus Valley.
A massive footprint.
Huge. And they operated through this system of satrapies, or provincial governors, which maintained a really tight grip on regional trade and politics. But then Alexander the Great campaigns through the Near East and defeats the Achaemenids. This culminates in the late 4th century BCE, and he just shatters that central authority.
And then things get messy.
Very. Following Alexander's death in 3 to 23 BCE, his generals basically carve up his conquests into competing Hellenistic kingdoms, like the Seleucid Empire, for instance.
And that creates a massive power vacuum out in the periphery. The central authority that used to just dictate terms to the Caucasus is suddenly gone, replaced by these warring successor states. And into that specific vacuum steps a figure named Parnavaz I.
Right, Parnavaz I.
The historical sources indicate he ruled from roughly 302 BCE to 237 BCE, and he's recognized as the founder of the Farnavizid dynasty, which is the first major royal house of Iberia. His rise to power is characterized by his defeat of a southern chieftain named Ezon.
Yeah, and the defeat of Ezon provides that initial moment of territorial unification. But Parnavaz I didn't just conquer territory. The records show he systematically organized it. The sources detail administrative reforms that were just vital for early state building.
Which is the real difference between a warlord and a king.
Exactly. He divided the newly unified country into distinct counties, which were called Serestavos. And each of these counties was overseen by a duke or an Aristavi.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of a Serestavo. When we say he divided the country into counties, this isn't just someone drawing abstract lines on a map.
Like, it's highly functional.
An Aristavi would be responsible for local tax collection, raising regional military levies, and administering justice on behalf of the crown. It's a fundamental transition from loose tribal loyalties to a structured, top-down administrative grid.
It really is. And if you look at the medieval Georgian chronicle, the Kartlistak Orvaba, which translates to the life of Kartli, the portrayal of Parnavaz is just monumental.
They really build him up.
Oh, absolutely. The text describes him as this ultimate unifier possessing a divine radiance. The chronicle credits him with building the massive citadel of Armasik and even establishing a Proto-Georgian script known as Mergvlavani. The Kartliska Reba places Parnavaz at the absolute center of Georgian statehood. It attributes literacy, monumental architecture, and a literal divine mandate directly to his personal agency. We also see in the early administration of the Iberian state certain diarchic elements.
Now, when I hear the term diarchic, I immediately think of ancient Sparta, where they literally had two kings from two completely different royal houses ruling simultaneously. But how does that system actually function in early Iberia without causing, constant civil war? Doesn't splitting power just create two rival factions within the court?
Well, it functions quite differently than the Spartan model. In the early Iberian context, diarchy often paired a senior king with a junior co-ruler.
Ah, okay, like a mentor situation.
Exactly. Usually it was a designated crown prince or an exceptionally powerful viceroy from a prominent noble family. This was a deliberate mechanism designed specifically to preempt succession crises.
So it smooths out the transitions.
Yeah. Rather than relying strictly on primogeniture, where the eldest son just automatically inherits absolute power upon the king's death, this system served as an apprenticeship and a power-sharing agreement. It suggests a society built on proto-feudal social contracts. The king really needed the buy-in of the top nobility. By sharing executive authority, he bound the most powerful factions to the success of the central state.
Okay, I need to interject here with some skepticism regarding the primary source material. We are relying heavily on the Kartlis Koavreba for this whole narrative about Parnavaz I, his divine radiance, and his single-handed invention of an entire alphabet.
Sure.
But this chronicle was compiled centuries, and in some parts almost an entire millennium, after these events supposedly took place. So looking at the contemporary archaeological and written evidence, is Parnavaz I a genuine, verifiable historical figure? Or are we dealing with, composite mythological hero created by later medieval kings who desperately needed a legendary founder to legitimize their own dynastic rule?
That is actually a central historiographical debate. From a strictly empirical standpoint, we have no contemporary inscriptions or coins from the 3rd century BCE that explicitly name Parnavaz I. External sources like Greek or Roman histories from that exact period, they just don't mention him.
Which is a pretty big red flag.
It is. The intense mythological elements in the chronicle, the divine radiance, the spontaneous creation of a fully formed script, those are standard hallmarks of retrospective nation building.
Yeah.
Later dynasties, specifically the Bagrationi dynasty, required a cohesive, unbroken origin story to justify their authority over the region.
Right. They basically needed a founding father figure to anchor their own legitimacy.
Exactly. However, modern scholars don't just dismiss the narrative entirely. The structural transition from tribal confederations to a centralized state utilizing that Sarastavo system absolutely had to occur. And the archaeological record confirms it did occur during this specific Hellenistic period.
So someone was doing the work.
Yes. There was likely a foundational leader, or maybe a series of early state builders, whose concrete administrative achievements were later amalgamated and mythologized into this singular persona of Parnavaz.
So regardless of whether Parnavaz was one man or a composite of several different leaders, the physical results of that state building are undeniable. And when you actually examine the physical geography of the Caucasus, you understand exactly why a structured, centralized state was so necessary for survival.
The terrain dictates everything.
It really does. The Caucasus is this rugged, mountainous landscape characterized by highly strategic choke points. And the most critical of these is the Darial Pass, known historically as the Iberian Gates.
The Darial Pass is a narrow, just incredibly deep gorge, cutting directly through the center of the Greater Caucasus mountain range. The sheer rock walls rise vertically on either side of the rushing Terek River.
It's intimidating just to look at.
Very much so. And the early Iberian leadership realized that whoever controlled that specific pass basically controlled the flow of trade and military movement between the northern Eurasian steppes and the Near East.
It is the ultimate geographical bottleneck. If you garrison the Iberian Gates, an invading army cannot utilize its numbers. They can't turn your flanks because there are no flanks. It's just solid mountain walls. By holding that gate, the Iberian state could tax the lucrative trade routes flowing north and south.
Right, a massive source of income.
But more importantly, they could physically block northern nomadic tribes from raiding down into their territory or into the wealthy territories of the empires further south.
Yeah, and controlling the Darien Pass transformed Iberia from just an isolated mountain kingdom into a geopolitical necessity for the empires to the south. The empires desperately needed that door kept shut.
They relied on it.
They did. And while controlling that gate and building local origin myths helped solidify Iberia's internal foundation, the kingdom's long-term survival depended entirely on its ability to communicate, negotiate, and trade with those massive southern powers. That necessity leads directly to a highly unique linguistic and cultural landscape.
Which requires us to look at the wealth of viceroys and the specific use of the written word. The material wealth generated by this kingdom is really striking, particularly when you look at the archaeological excavations at Armazaskivi, which is situated near the ancient capital of Mitskeda.
The finds there are incredible.
Yeah, excavations there have revealed a highly complex society operating from the 1st century BCE onwards. We are not looking at rudimentary hill forts or subsistence farming communities here. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of grand palaces, sophisticated bathhouses featuring advanced ceramic plumbing systems, extensive commercial wine cellars, and large-scale ceramics workshops.
The infrastructure clearly indicates a society deeply integrated into broader regional trade networks and accustomed to really high standards of living. And situated right alongside those monumental structures is the necropolis, the burial grounds for the Bidash.
And the Bidash were essentially the viceroys, right?
Right. The Bidash were the local governors who basically operated as the second in command to the Iberian king. When archaeologists excavated these tombs, they found incredibly rich deposits.
Right. The deceased were interred with intricate gold and silver jewelry, heavy signet rings carved with elaborate intaglios, and just vast quantities of imported coins. But what tells the real story here is the origin of these grave goods. It is this distinct mix of Roman, Parthian, and locally crafted wealth. The artifacts themselves physically map the geopolitical fault line we talked about.
They absolutely do.
But the most telling artifacts found in these areas are actually the inscriptions. The administrative language of pre-Christian Iberia was not Georgian, at least not in written form. They utilized Old Aramaic.
Yes. Specifically, they developed a local, heavily modified variant of the Aramaic script, which epigraphers call the Armasian script.
So, to understand how this functioned, we have to look at the concept of alloglottography. The term literally translates to writing in another language. The Iberian elite, the scribes, and the Bidash used this Armasian script to record official decrees, carve epitaphs, and maintain state records. But the linguistic consensus is that when an Iberian official stood in the town square to read that decree to the public, they were not speaking the Aramaic language out loud. They were looking at the Aramaic symbols and translating them in real time, speaking aloud in the native Georgian language.
Yeah, it functioned as a highly efficient administrative tool. Aramaic was basically the lingua franca of the Near East. It was a deeply entrenched legacy left over from the Achaemenid Persian Empire's bureaucratic system.
It was what everyone used for official business.
Right. Utilizing Aramaic script, Iberian state officials ensured their documents were legible to international diplomats, merchants, and foreign courts, while still serving the local populace through simultaneous oral translation.
To put this into perspective for you, think about a basic math equation. If you write down the numerical equation 2 + 2 = 4, you are using universal symbols. A person from London looks at those symbols and says 2 + 2 = 4. A person from Madrid looks at the exact same symbols and says 2 más 2 son 4. A person from Tokyo says ni tasu ni wayon.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right. The written symbols are identical and universally understood across borders, but the spoken output changes completely depending on the native language of the reader. That is exactly how alloglottography functioned in ancient Iberia. The script was a vehicle for holding information, totally independent of the phonetic sounds of the spoken tongue.
The script was essentially a technology for data storage, not a direct transcript of speech. And we see the culmination of this linguistic intersection on a specific, highly important artifact, the Armazi bilingual stele.
Tell us about the stele.
Well, this is a stone monument featuring two texts, one carved in ancient Greek and one carved in the Armazian Aramaic script. It is an epitaph dedicated to a young noblewoman named Serapidis.
The stele is really instructive because it physically demonstrates how thoroughly the society was blending the Hellenistic world of the Greeks and Romans with the Iranian cultural spheres of the Parthians. And linguistically, the Armasian text shows significant local adaptations.
Yeah, they were very creative with it.
For example, they used the Aramaic consonant letter ain to function as a vowel. They did this specifically to accurately spell out Greek names like Serapidus because traditional Aramaic just didn't have the vowel structures to handle Hellenistic nomenclature.
Exactly. They were actively modifying the administrative language of the East to accommodate the naming conventions of the West. It reflects a deeply syncretic society that just refused to be categorized strictly as either Eastern or Western. But this administrative practice raises a really complex question regarding cultural identity.
That is exactly what I want to unpack here. If you have a society that practices alloglottography writing in an imported language like Aramaic, but speaking a local language like Georgian, how does that shape the Iberian national identity? Before a dedicated Georgian alphabet was fully formalized centuries later, did this reliance on foreign scripts hinder their sense of self as a distinct people?
The evidence actually suggests it did the opposite. It insulated their identity. In the ancient world, elite administrative languages often existed entirely apart from the vernacular spoken by the masses. By adopting Aramaic for statecraft, the Iberian elite proved they were a sophisticated, literate player in international diplomacy.
They could sit at the adults' table.
Exactly. They possessed the bureaucratic infrastructure to correspond with Parthian kings and Roman governors on equal footing. Meanwhile, the spoken Georgian language remained the exclusive cultural glue for the broader population.
So the spoken language was kept somewhat pure, or at least local.
Right. The elite acted as a linguistic bridge, utilizing international bureaucratic tools to interact with empires, thereby protecting the local spoken identity from being overwritten by a foreign tongue.
And the tangible rewards of that diplomatic bridge building are the massive silver vessels found in these Iberian burials. We are talking about exquisite, heavy pieces of silverware, such as the Kazbegi silver bowl, or the really ornate vessels discovered at the sites of Sargveshi and Edoplis Gora.
Yeah, these vessels are not merely decorative household items for the elite. In the ancient world, heavy, intricately crafted silverware functioned as high-level diplomatic currency. These specific vessels were sent by Roman emperors and later Sasanian kings directly to the Iberian royalty and the Bidash.
Let's call them what they were in a geopolitical context. They were basically highly formalized bribes.
Oh, they were absolutely calculated inducements. They served as tangible, highly visible symbols of alliance and obligation. When a Roman emperor sends a solid silver bowl bearing imperial iconography to an Iberian viceroy, it is a transaction. The emperor is actively purchasing loyalty and influence.
It's very transactional.
Totally. The heavy presence of these vessels in Iberian graves indicates precisely how desperately the surrounding superpowers wanted to keep Iberia aligned with their respective military interests.
Which moves us perfectly into the core conflict that made Iberian loyalty so valuable in the first place. We need to look at the crossroads of empires, specifically the endless proxy wars fought between Rome and Parthia. Because having Iberia as a loyal ally meant controlling the passes of the Caucasus, and controlling the Caucasus meant you could essentially outflank your imperial rival.
Right, the dynamic formally shifts in the year 65 BCE. The Roman general, Pompey the Great, is conducting his massive eastern campaign. Following his victories in the Mithridatic Wars, Pompey pushes his legions into the Caucasus, bringing Iberia directly into the Roman sphere of influence for the first time.
And it wasn't a peaceful entry.
No, not at all. The Iberian king at the time, Artaxerxes, actually attempts to resist the Roman advance. He engages Pompey's forces, utilizing the difficult terrain, but the military disparity is simply too great. The Roman logistical machine and heavy infantry just overpower the local forces. Artaxerxes is ultimately defeated and forced to plead for terms. He accepts a formal status as a friend and ally of the Roman people.
Which is the polite Roman legal fiction for a client state.
A very polite fiction, yes.
But the politics of the region were so volatile that the Farnavizid dynasty actually loses control of the Iberian throne for several decades following this Roman intervention. From 90 BCE down to 30 BCE, the Iberian crown is taken over by the Artaxiads, who were a branch of the Armenian royal family. And this takeover was heavily backed by the regional dominance of the Armenian king, Tigranes the Great.
Tigranes the Great had forged a massive, albeit temporary, Armenian empire that briefly eclipsed Parthian power in the region. Iberia was swept right up in that aggressive expansion. But after Rome decisively defeats Tigranes, the geopolitical board is reset once again.
Everything goes back to zero.
Basically. With the Armenian threat neutralized by Rome, the original Iberian dynastic lines eventually maneuver their way back to power. By the 1st century CE, we see the rise of a truly formidable Iberian king, Pharismanes I.
Now, Pharismanes I provides an absolute masterclass in aggressive political maneuvering. He rules through the middle of the 1st century CE, and he perfectly understands how to play the superpowers against each other to achieve his own goals. During the Roman-Parthian War, which lasted from 58 to 63 CE, Pharismanes explicitly throws Iberian military support behind the Roman war effort.
And he leverages that Roman military support and diplomatic cover to achieve his own territorial ambitions. Pharismanes wants to dominate the neighboring kingdom of Armenia, essentially removing it entirely from Parthian influence.
He sees an opportunity and takes it.
He really does. With Roman backing, he successfully executes a plan to install his own brother, Mithridates, on the Armenian throne. This secures Iberian dominance over their southern neighbor and acts as a massive strategic bloc against the Parthian Empire.
But the dynastic ruthlessness of the Iberian kings, the sheer pragmatism, really shows itself a few years later. The political winds shift. Pharismanes decides that his brother Mithridates is no longer serving Iberian interests effectively in Armenia. He feels his brother is becoming too independent.
Right, he's losing control of him.
So what is his solution? He doesn't petition the Roman Senate for a change in leadership. He doesn't negotiate a peaceful abdication. Pharismanes instigates his own son, a prince named Radamistus, to march into Armenia and violently overthrow his uncle, Mithridates.
The historical accounts of this event are just brutal. Radamistus besieges his uncle, ultimately capturing him. And to avoid the taboo of spilling royal blood with a sword, Radamistus reportedly has his uncle, the king of Armenia, smothered to death under heavy carpets and cushions.
What an awful way to go.
Truly, it is a family betrayal driven entirely by realpolitik. Pharismanes realized that to maintain absolute Iberian dominance over the Armenian buffer zone, he needed someone directly under his control, his own ambitious son, rather than a brother who had developed independent alliances.
Now, classic historical narratives, which are largely written by Roman historians, tend to frame smaller border states like Iberia as mere pawns on the chessboard of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The prevailing narrative is that the Romans moved the Iberian pawn to check the Parthian king.
Right, that's the standard Roman view.
But looking at the actual mechanics of what Pharismanes I achieved, I have to challenge that Roman-centric narrative. Was Pharismanes really a Roman pawn, or was he actually the one manipulating Roman military resources and diplomatic weight to fund and protect an aggressive Iberian expansion into Armenia?
If you evaluate the material outcomes, Pharismanes emerges as the puppet master in this specific scenario. Rome provided the diplomatic cover and the logistical threat that kept Parthia at bay, while Pharismanes used Iberian troops and his own family members to actively seize and hold Armenian territory.
So he got all the benefits with almost none of the risk.
Exactly. He extracted the maximum geopolitical benefit from the Roman alliance while bearing very little of the existential risk. The Romans in the Senate genuinely believed they were utilizing him to secure their eastern frontier, but he was actively using their vast military reputation to build an Iberian hegemony in the Caucasus.
And you can see exactly how Rome chose to spin this relationship publicly to their own citizens by looking at the Res Gesti Divi Augusti.
The Deeds of the Divine Augustus. This is the monumental autobiographical inscription left by the first Roman emperor Augustus, detailing his life's achievements.
In this massive public text, Augustus lists his vast conquests and diplomatic triumphs. And when he refers to states like Iberia, he does not list them as conquered provinces paying regular tribute. He specifically frames them as friendly states. The text boasts that kings from Iberia and Albania proactively sent diplomatic missions across the world to seek the friendship and protection of the Roman center.
Augustus is utilizing a very specific political framing to mask a military limitation. The Roman Empire, for all its logistical brilliance, lacked the capacity to permanently occupy and garrison the mountainous, hostile terrain of the Caucasus.
It's just a nightmare for supply lines.
A total nightmare. It was too far from their supply lines, too rugged, and the continuous cost of fighting mountain guerrillas would be astronomical. So, by legally designating Iberia as a friendly satellite state, Augustus turns a glaring military limitation into a massive public diplomatic victory.
Spin control.
Pure spin control. He portrays the Iberian kings as willing supplicants, drawn in by the sheer glory of Rome, rather than acknowledging the reality. Rome desperately needed Iberia to voluntarily hold the mountain passes against Parthia and the northern nomads.
It is ancient public relations at its finest. And for a generation, Pharasmanes I was happy to play the role of the loyal, friendly ally because that Roman backing served his own expansionist goals. But that carefully constructed diplomatic facade was not built to last. The descendants of Pharasmanes I would test the absolute limits of Roman patience,
You certainly did.
proving that Iberia was, at its core, fiercely independent. This transitions us into a period of outright defiance and the literal weaponization of nomads.
We move into the 2nd century CE here, specifically the reign of King Pharasmanes II, who earns the historical epithet the Brave.
And he earns that title through an act of sheer diplomatic audacity. He looks directly at one of the most powerful and demanding Roman emperors in history, Hadrian, and effectively says no.
Yeah, and you just didn't do that to Hadrian.
Right. Hadrian was an emperor known for touring his provinces, inspecting his borders, and demanding total adherence to Roman protocol from client kings. He sends a formal summons to Pharasmanes II, ordering the Iberian king to travel to Rome to pay his respects, and Pharasmanes simply refuses to go. He treats a summons from the Emperor of Rome like a piece of junk mail.
Refusing a direct summons from a Roman emperor is not a casual oversight. It is an act of extreme diplomatic hostility. It signals a complete rejection of vassal status and a public challenge to Roman authority in the East. But Pharasmanes II does not just stop at ignoring imperial letters. He implements a highly aggressive, deeply calculated military strategy. He turns his attention to the north, to the Eurasian steppes, and forms a tactical alliance with the Alans.
The Alans were a fierce, nomadic warrior culture, renowned across the ancient world for their heavy-shot cavalry and composite bows. They were highly mobile and devastating in open battle.
And remember the Iberian gates, the Darien Pass we discussed earlier. Pharasmanes II maintained total control over it. In an act of strategic brilliance and high-stakes brinkmanship, he deliberately orders the passes opened. He allows massive raiding parties of Alan cavalry to pour through the Caucasus Mountains entirely unhindered.
He just opens the floodgates.
He opens the gates.
And he points them south. He directs these devastating raids into Parthian territories and, crucially, into Roman-controlled Cappadocia in Asia Minor.
By weaponizing the nomadic tribes, Pharasmanes inflicts severe economic and military damage on the two superpowers pressuring his borders. And he executes this strategy with total plausible deniability. He isn't officially marching the Iberian standing army against Roman legions.
So he can claim his hands are clean.
Exactly. He is simply failing to close a mountain gate, allowing a force of nature to wreak havoc, all while asserting that Iberia is the only regional power capable of stopping them, if the price is right, of course.
That is a terrifying geopolitical lever to pull. We know from the contemporary Roman historian Dio Cassius just what a logistical nightmare this caused for the Roman military. Dio Cassius writes about the Roman governor of Cappadocia at the time, a highly capable man named Flavius Arrianus.
Arrianus had a miserable time.
Oh, he really did. Arrianus is out there on the frontier desperately trying to organize rigid Roman infantry legions to fend off these highly mobile, hit-and-run Alan cavalry raids. He is fighting a bleeding war of attrition, burning through resources because the diplomatic summons to the Iberian king are just being ignored. So, looking at the mechanics of this, I have to ask, Rome is the preeminent military power on Earth. Why did they tolerate this humiliation?
It's a great question.
Why didn't Hadrian or his successor just mobilize 3 legions, march into Iberia, burn the capital Mosqueda to the ground, and publicly execute Pharasmanes II?
Well, it comes down to a strict cost-benefit analysis and the brutal realities of ancient military logistics. Launching a full-scale punitive invasion into the rugged, highly defensible terrain of the Caucasus Mountains would require a massive mobilization. Rome would have to drain vital troops from the Rhine or the Danube frontiers, leaving those borders totally vulnerable.
Which they could not afford to do.
Not at all. Furthermore, if Rome successfully destroyed the Iberian state apparatus, they would create a new problem. They would have to permanently garrison the Iberian gates themselves to stop future nomadic incursions. That means supplying and paying tens of thousands of Roman troops in a remote, hostile mountain range indefinitely. It was an astronomical, continuous expense. It was ultimately cheaper, both in Roman blood and denarii, to simply buy Pharos men off.
And buy him off they did. When Hadrian passes away, the new emperor, Antoninus Pius, changes tactics entirely. He abandons the demands for submission and actively seeks reconciliation. Pharasmanes II finally agrees to travel to Rome, and the reception he receives is mind-boggling in its scale.
It is. He is not received as a penitent rebel or a defeated client king. He is received with immense, almost unprecedented honor. Antoninus Pius expands the official borders of the Iberian kingdom, granting them lucrative territory in Colchis on the Black Sea coast. The emperor holds vast military exercises in the capital, specifically to honor the Iberian king and his son, treating them as esteemed military poors.
And the ultimate gesture. The Romans erect a massive equestrian statue of Pharismanes II in the Temple of Bellona, the Roman goddess of war. Just think about the mechanics of that decision for a second. A foreign king who actively unleashed nomadic barbarians to ravage Roman provinces, causing massive economic damage, is rewarded with prime real estate and a permanent statue in the heart of Rome's military religious center.
It's quite the turnaround.
It is the ultimate proof that the Iberian strategy of aggressive balancing and brinkmanship worked perfectly.
It was a highly effective geopolitical balancing act. The Iberian kings had mastered the art of being just dangerous enough to be respected and feared, but valuable enough not to be destroyed. However, this dynamic relied heavily on the specific nature of the Parthian Empire to the east.
Right.
The Parthians were somewhat decentralized, politically fractured, and generally tolerant of local customs as long as tribute was paid. In the 3rd century, that variable changes permanently. A new, far more aggressive and ideologically driven power replaces the Parthians, bringing intense religious and cultural demands right to Iberia's borders.
We are talking about the rise of the Sasanian Empire, but before we examine how the Sasanians violently changed the rules of the game, we need to understand the cultural and religious landscape they were trying to overwrite. What exactly was the pre-Christian cosmos of ancient Iberia?
Well, pre-Christian Iberia featured a deeply complex polytheistic religious landscape. As we mentioned earlier, the foundation myths state that Parnavaz I established the state cult of the supreme god, Armazi. Armazi is a notable deity, syncretic in nature, often associated with the moon, but also possessing the martial traits of a warrior god.
And the archaeological evidence paints a very vivid picture of how the population actually worshipped. Archaeologists have excavated numerous sites across eastern Georgia that show clear, undeniable evidence of fire worship and Mithraic cults. At places like Samadlo and Didoplis Mindori, they have found the remains of massive fire temples.
These were not small, localized, informal shrines. Didoplis Mindori, for instance, features a vast, highly structured temple complex specifically designed for the continuous ritualistic burning of sacred fires. We also see this religious iconography blending seamlessly into daily economic life. Kolki and amphorae, which were large clay storage jars used for transporting wine or oil, are frequently stamped with specific motifs.
Like what kind of motif?
Things like horsemen, multi-pointed stars, and crescent moons. These are strong, recognized indicators of Mithraic solar and martial cults.
The Mithraic and fire worship elements clearly originate from Iranian cultural spheres to the east, but the political reality shifts drastically in the year 224 CE. The Parthian Empire collapses under internal pressure, and the Sasanian Empire rises in its place.
And the Sasanians are fundamentally different from the Parthians in how they govern. The Parthian Arsacid dynasty operated a relatively loose feudal style of suzerainty. As long as a client state paid its tribute and didn't formally ally with Rome, the Parthians largely let you govern yourself and worship your own gods.
We have been let live mostly.
Mostly, yeah. The Sasanian dynasty, however, was highly centralized and ideologically driven. They viewed themselves as the true, direct inheritors of the ancient Achaemenid Persian glory. And crucially, they promoted a strict, state-sponsored Orthodox version of Zoroastrianism.
They weren't just interested in political loyalty or tax revenue. They demanded total cultural and religious assimilation. They wanted to integrate all these diverse buffer states into a unified, rigid Zoroastrian cosmos.
Initially, the Roman Empire manages to hold the Sasanians off. In the year 298, the Peace of Nisibis is signed between Rome and the Sasanian Empire. This treaty temporarily reaffirms Roman control over the Caucasus, including Iberia. But everyone in the Iberian court knew this peace was extremely fragile. The Sasanian threat of total cultural absorption was looming right on the horizon.
So, looking at the physical evidence from this period, the elite burials containing silver rita, which are these ornate horn-shaped drinking vessels, and phylae, these shallow offering bowls, often intricately decorated with images of fire altars.
Right.
How deeply had these Iranian religious practices actually permeated everyday Iberian life? Was the average Iberian farmer meticulously tending a sacred fire, or was this just the aesthetic of the elite class adopting the trappings of the dominant regional power to sort of grease the wheels of diplomacy?
It is a critical distinction to make. The archaeological evidence suggests a deeply syncretic reality. a blending of traditions. For the Iberian elite, adopting Iranian religious aesthetics and participating in formalized fire worship was a way to integrate with the aristocratic networks of the East. It was cultural currency that facilitated trade and alliances.
It's good for business.
Exactly. But at the grassroots level, out in the valleys and mountains, these imported concepts were merged with ancient local Caucasian traditions.
So it wasn't the pure Orthodox Zoroastrianism that the Sasanians were pushing?
No, it was distinctly Iberian. For example, strict Orthodox Zoroastrianism strictly forbids the pollution of the sacred elements, especially fire and earth with dead flesh. Yet, in the Iberian archaeological record, we find evidence of animal sacrifices being performed in close proximity to these fire altars.
Oh, which the Sasanians would have hated.
They would have found it abhorrent. We see sacred hunting rituals that honor local mountain deities being visually merged with the iconography of Mithras. It was a localized, hybrid cosmology that existed long before the rigid concepts of strict monotheism arrived.
But with the Sasanians aggressively pushing a rigid, orthodox version of Zoroastrianism across their borders, the Iberian leadership realized that their syncretic, flexible religious landscape was suddenly a massive political vulnerability. The Sasanians were going to use religious orthodoxy as a tool of conquest and assimilation. Facing this existential threat, the Iberian monarchy makes a profound, calculated state decision that will alter the nation's trajectory permanently.
This brings us to a pivotal shift in the 4th century. The reign of King Mirian III, the founder of the Chosroid dynasty and the formal Christianization of Iberia.
Around the year 320, a woman named Saint Nino arrives in Iberia. She is a missionary from Cappadocia in Asia Minor, carrying a cross famously made of grapevine tied together with her own hair. And her arrival initiates a seismic shift in the culture.
Saint Nino does not begin her mission by preaching to the masses in the countryside. She operates strategically within the royal sphere. The historical texts record her initial success in converting the Iberian queen Nana.
How did that happen?
Well, Queen Nana was suffering from a severe, seemingly incurable illness. According to the hagiographies, Nino heals her through prayer, and this miraculous event leads directly to the queen's conversion.
But King Mirian remains a staunch pagan, devoted to Armazi and the traditional syncretic gods of his ancestors. That is, until a very specific, highly dramatic event occurs. It is the defining narrative vignette of Iberian Christianization. King Mirian is out on a hunting trip on Mount Koti.
And we should note, hunting was not just a leisure activity. It was the ultimate symbol of royal vigor, control over nature, and martial prowess in the ancient world.
Right, he is in his element, surrounded by his retinue. Suddenly, according to the chronicles, the sky goes completely black. A sudden, blinding, impenetrable darkness falls over the mountain. Mirian is terrified, physically isolated from his guards in the pitch black. He prays to his traditional pagan gods, to Armazi, to the local mountain deities, begging them to lift the darkness and restore the light. Nothing happens. The silence is absolute.
And then?
In a moment of sheer desperation, he makes a vow. He promises that if he is saved from this darkness, he will exclusively worship the god of his wife. He prays to Nino's god.
And according to the chronicles, the moment he offers that specific prayer, the darkness vanishes instantly. The sun returns, illuminating the mountain.
Mirian returns to the capital city, Mtskheta, completely transformed by the experience. He seeks out Saint Nino and declares his intention to adopt her faith. Following this, Christianity is formally adopted as the state religion, a date modern scholars place around 326 or 337.
The physical transformation of the Iberian landscape begins immediately after this. The grand, monumental idol of the supreme god Armazi is thrown down and destroyed by royal decree, and King Mirian orders the construction of the very first church at Mtskheta, built directly in the king's own garden.
That's a huge shift.
Huge. This specific site would eventually become the location of the monumental Svetitskhovili Cathedral, which actually remains the spiritual center of Georgia to this day.
It is an incredible narrative of spiritual awakening, but if we analyze this through the cold lens of geopolitics, the timing is critical. When King Mirian converts, he is not just saving his soul, he is radically realigning the geopolitical trajectory of his entire state. Let's break down this conversion not just as a religious epiphany, but as a calculated, defensive geopolitical alignment.
Yeah, you have to look at the context. King Mirian's conversion occurs during the reign of Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity and begin institutionalizing it within the empire. By adopting Christianity as the official state religion, Mirian is creating an impenetrable cultural firewall against Sasanian Persia.
Because the Sasanians were demanding Zoroastrian assimilation as a precursor to political absorption.
Exactly. Miriam counters this by officially linking Iberia's spiritual and cultural identity directly to the Roman Empire. It is a loud public declaration that Iberia belongs to the Christian Roman sphere. This effectively draws a line in the sand that the Sasanians could not cross through mere cultural pressure or soft power.
To put it another way, adopting Christianity was like changing the tuning of the entire state's instrument. They tuned themselves to resonate perfectly with the diplomatic and cultural frequency of Rome, which simultaneously created a harsh, unresolvable dissonance with the frequency of Sasanian Persia. The two states were now operating on fundamentally incompatible ideological wavelengths.
That's exactly what happened.
But I have to wonder about the mechanics of this on the ground. We know King Marian and Queen Nana converted, but did the general population actually accept this massive overnight change? Or was this a top-down mandate enforced by the swords of the royal guard?
It was undeniably a top-down initiative, and the transition was not seamless. The urban elite and the nobility converted first, clearly recognizing the political, economic, and diplomatic benefits of aligning with Rome's expanding Christian network.
They saw the writing on the wall.
They did. However, for the rural population isolated in the mountain valleys, who were deeply attached to their ancestral syncretic practices and local shrines, the transition was much slower and often met with fierce resistance. The full, genuine Christianization of the countryside took centuries. It required the eventual establishment of extensive monastic networks, monks physically moving into these remote areas to truly penetrate and alter the local culture.
But the immediate diplomatic payoff with the Roman Empire was substantial and well documented. We have records of correspondence between King Mirian III and Emperor Constantine the Great. Constantine is absolutely thrilled by this development. It secures his eastern flank ideologically. He immediately sends Christian clergy and highly skilled Roman masons to help design and build the new Iberian churches.
He even goes a step further and allocates specific space in Jerusalem for the construction of a dedicated Iberian church.
That allocation of physical space in Jerusalem is a really critical detail. It firmly and visibly integrates Iberia into the Roman imperial commonwealth. They are no longer viewed merely as a peripheral, barbaric buffer state. They are recognized as legitimate stakeholders in the spiritual geography of the new Christian Roman world.
It elevates their status permanently on the world stage.
But while this alignment secured Roman support and cultural independence, it absolutely infuriated the Sasanian Empire. The cultural firewall worked, but the Sasanians were not going to just walk away from the Caucasus. The formal declaration of Christianity guaranteed a brutal, centuries-long struggle for the very soul and sovereignty of Iberia. This leads us to the final and perhaps most resilient chapter of this history: rebellion, the fall of the monarchy, and silent resistance.
The Sasanian pushback in the 4th and 5th centuries is severe and relentless. The Sasanian leadership correctly recognized that a Christian Iberia was a permanent Roman bridgehead in the Caucasus, a direct threat to their own northern borders. In 363, Sasanian King Shepur II launches a massive military invasion of Iberia.
And it's overwhelming, right?
Totally. The sheer weight of the Sasanian army overwhelms the local defenses. Shepur opposes the ruling king and installs his own vassal, a man named Aspacuras II.
But the Sasanians don't just want political control and tax revenue this time. They want total ideological submission. They actively impose Zoroastrian magi, the priests of the state religion, upon the Iberian cities. They fund and build Zoroastrian fire temples directly inside major Iberian population centers like Tbilisi, and they force a brutal policy of dual religious observance upon the Iberian nobility.
The Iberian nobles were caught in an impossible, psychologically exhausting position. To maintain their ancestral lands, their titles, and their political influence under the Sasanian governor, or Marsman, they had to publicly participate in Zoroastrian rituals. They had to be seen tending the sacred fires and supporting the Magi.
But privately, they were still Christian.
Right. Behind closed doors, they maintained their Christian faith. It created a deeply fractured, paranoid societal reality where public compliance masked private defiance.
This tension inevitably boils over into open armed rebellion. In the 5th century, we see the rise of one of Georgia's greatest national heroes, King Vakhtang I Gorgasali. He inherits a kingdom basically suffocating under the forced conversion policies and heavy taxation mandated by the Sasanian king Yazdegerd II.
And Vakhtang Gorgasali refuses to submit to the slow erasure of his culture. He leverages Christian solidarity, actively allying with neighboring Armenian Christians who were suffering under the exact same Sasanian edicts. In 482, he launches a massive, highly coordinated regional rebellion.
He just decides enough is enough.
Yeah, he expels the Sasanian garrisons from the cities and orders his men to physically dismantle the fire altars that had been forced upon his people.
It is a moment of intense, violent resistance, but ultimately the demographic and military weight of the Sasanian Empire is just too much for the Caucasus to hold off indefinitely. After decades of grinding proxy wars, sieges, and localized rebellions, the Sasanian Empire decides they have had enough of managing unruly Iberian kings. In the year 580, the Sasanian king Hormizd IV takes a radical step. He formally abolishes the Iberian kingship entirely.
It is the absolute collapse of the central monarchy that Barnabas I had built centuries earlier.
It's gone.
The Sasanians implement direct, centralized rule. They install a Marzben, a Persian viceroy backed by a Persian garrison, to govern the province directly from Tbilisi. The royal bodyguard is dissolved, the tax revenues are redirected straight to Ctesiphon, and the Iberian state, as an independent political entity, officially ceases to exist.
When a king is deposed and the crown is shattered, you would expect the national identity to shatter with it. But the loss of the monarchy did not mean the loss of the Iberian identity, and this is where the mechanics of survival get incredibly nuanced. We have physical, archaeological evidence of how the Iberian elites adapted to this total political subjugation. Let's analyze the Kartveli-Sasanian coinage from the late 6th and early 7th centuries.
These specific coins are just a masterclass in subversive statecraft. Even though the central monarchy was abolished, local Iberian presiding princes, men like Warham I and Stepanos I, were still granted the bureaucratic authority by the Sasanians to mint regional copper and silver coinage.
Just to keep the local economy functioning.
Exactly.
Now, a standard Sasanian coin of this era has a very specific, rigidly enforced layout. The front features a large, detailed profile of the ruling Shahanshah, the Sasanian king of kings. The reverse side prominently features a large Zoroastrian sacred fire altar flanked by 2 armed attendants. It is essentially a metallic billboard for Sasanian political and religious supremacy, circulating through every market in the empire.
And the Iberian princes were legally required to mint these exact coins. They had to put the Shahanshah's face on the currency, but they made subtle, highly intentional modifications to the dies used to strike the reverse side of the coins.
This is one of the most compelling details in numismatic history to me. They take that prominent sacred Zoroastrian flame on the reverse, and they subtly replace it with a small Christian cross. And around the edges of the coin, they stamp Georgian monograms, spelling out their own local names. How did these tiny metallic acts of rebellion actually function on a societal level? How did altering a coin help preserve Georgian national identity when the monarchy itself had been completely erased?
It was a demonstration of unyielding cultural resilience, communicating directly with the populace. These coins had to pass through Sasanian bureaucratic hands. They were used to pay taxes, yet the Iberians dared to stamp the symbol of their Roman-aligned faith directly over the symbol of their conqueror's religion.
Right under their noses.
In an era without mass media, a coin is the most effective way to transmit an idea. It communicated a clear, continuous message to the Iberian population who handled the currency daily. We may be subjects of the Persian Empire politically, but culturally and spiritually, we remain autonomous. It kept the idea of an independent Christian Iberian identity literally circulating in the pockets of every citizen.
And you can see that same defensive resilience mirrored in the physical landscape. Ancient mountaintop pagan shrines, places that had been sacred for millennia, were rapidly repurposed. The Iberians built small, highly fortified Christian churches directly on top of these remote peaks, such as the Basilica at Nikrasi.
They were physically fortifying their new religious identity against Persian incursions. A church on a steep mountaintop is not just a place of worship, it is a watchtower. It is a defensible redoubt. The landscape itself was conscripted into the physical defense of the Christian Iberian identity. The thick stone walls of these basilicas served both spiritual and military functions.
Which perfectly summarizes the legacy of this kingdom. The loss of the crown in 580 was a devastating political defeat, but the centuries of navigating between the crushing weight of Rome and Sasanian Persia had forged a societal resilience that was virtually unbreakable.
The administrative institutions, the unique alphabet, the adopted religion, and the fierce sense of local autonomy survived the fall of the monarchy. They endured the Sasanian occupation, and they would endure the Arab conquest that followed in the next century, eventually forming the indestructible bedrock for the unified medieval kingdom of Georgia centuries later.
As we conclude our analysis today, I want to return to that geological fault line we discussed at the very beginning. When you look at maps of the ancient world, it is incredibly easy to focus entirely on the massive, sweeping colors denoting the Roman and Persian empires. We tend to view buffer states like ancient Iberia merely as passive battlegrounds, just patches of dirt inevitably trampled by the legions and the heavy cataphracts of the superpowers.
A mere crumple zone for imperial ambitions.
Exactly, but the actual mechanics of Iberian history demand that we flip that perspective. Iberia was not just acted upon, it acted. Through calculated strategic conversions, brilliant linguistic adaptations like the alloglottographic Armazian script, and the terrifying weaponization of nomadic alliances, Iberia actively shaped the borders, the religions, and the diplomatic strategies of the empires that sought to consume it. Rome had to build statues to appease them. Persia had to alter its imperial administration to govern them. It forces us to consider a provocative thought. Perhaps in the grand machinery of history, it isn't always the massive center that dictates the narrative. Sometimes the resilient periphery dictates the absolute limits of the core.
It's a fascinating way to look at it.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.